Hi, everyone, and welcome to the AI and Open Education Initiative Speaker Series. Again, you are here at Professional Education and the Judicious Use of AI, which is part of the AI and Open Education Initiative Speaker Series. Welcome. My name is Shira Segal, and I am the Collaborations and Engagement Manager at MIT OpenCourseWare. I am also one of the planning committee members of the AI and Open Education Initiative at MIT Open Learning. In order to meet the moment of remarkable growth of artificial intelligence and to examine its benefits and challenges to the field of open education, last summer, MIT Open Learning solicited rapid response papers from stakeholders around the world to articulate how generative AI might accelerate or hinder the promise of open education. An international jury of AI and open education experts reviewed 147 submissions and published 9 thought-provoking papers by 32 researchers on the open platform PubPub, which you can find via the link in the chat. This initiative and today's Speaker Series webinar is generously funded by the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation. We want to thank Hewlett for their ongoing support. Today's session is the first of 2 webinars in the Initiative Speaker Series. Today's topic is professional education and the judicious use of AI. Our next webinar on May 12th is on AI literacies and evaluation, and we'll put the registration link for that in the chat. Please note that today's session is being recorded and will be openly licensed as an open educational resource that will be openly available to people around the world. We invite you to shape the narrative we are having about AI and open education and to help us navigate the terrain for new directions and new questions. So please add your voice and let your critiques, concerns, and enthusiasm be heard. You can do so through the Q&A function throughout today's session. Put your ideas in the Q&A as you have them. Rest assured that we will circle back to your comments and questions later in this session. You're welcome to let us know your name, role, or affiliation in your comments. If you do not want your name referenced in today's recording, you can post your questions anonymously. An overview of today's structure is as follows. First, I will briefly introduce today's speakers. Then our respondent will contextualize this moment for us. Third, the authors of the 2 spotlighted papers will provide a high-level overview of each of their papers. This will be followed by a discussion with the authors led by our respondent. And finally, we will open the discussion for your comments and questions. I'm thrilled to introduce today's speakers and papers. Clint Lalonde is today's respondent, and he is the Director of Open Education at BCcampus. BCcampus is a government-funded nonprofit organization that provides teaching, learning, educational technology, and open ed support for the 25 publicly funded post-secondary institutions of British Columbia. In 2013, Clint was instrumental in the launch of the BC Open Textbook Project and currently oversees the operations of the Provincial Open Textbook Repository and their open publishing platform. The author of our first featured paper is Dr. Aigerim Shilibekova. She is an associate professor of strategy and the founding director of the Centre for Teaching Excellence at University Canada West. She's also a PhD candidate in EdTech and learning design, pursuing her second PhD at Simon Fraser University. She's a multilingual educator from Kazakhstan whose research focuses on AI-powered instructional design, inclusive faculty development, and knowledge mobilization in diverse linguistic contexts. She's the author and editor of numerous policy papers and 4 books. The links will be in the chat. Her paper is Addressing Challenges in Faculty Professional Development, UDL Training through AI-Enhanced OER in a Non-English Context. One of the co-authors of today's second featured paper is Dr. Royce Kimmons. He's an associate professor of instructional psychology and technology at Brigham Young University. In his work, he seeks to end the effects of socioeconomic divides on educational opportunities through open education and transformative technology use. He is also the founder of edtechbooks.org and other sites focused on providing free, high-quality learning resources to all. The other co-author of today's second featured paper is Dr. Torrey. She's a professor of learning technology at University of Massachusetts Amherst. Her work centers on the critical examination of the relationship between teaching, learning, and technology, and how technology can support teachers in designing contexts that enhance student learning. She's written and designed several open educational resources, many of which have had millions of views. She is also the author of 5 books published on the edtechbooks.org site, and we'll put those links in the chat for you. Now, I'll pass the baton to our respondent, Clint Lalonde, to contextualize this moment for us.
Thank you very much, Shira, and thank you for inviting me to participate in this event today. I am joining you from the traditional territories of the Lekwungen-speaking peoples of the Songhees and Esquimalt nations, also known colonially as Vancouver Island, Victoria, British Columbia, to be exact. Thank you also to MIT Open Learning for sparking these discussions and launching the rapid response papers looking at the emerging relationship between open education and generative AI. As Sarah Schwetman says in her preface for the collection of responses, we are at a moment where, quote, AI is entering the public consciousness in a big way and reshaping how we learn, communicate, and collaborate, end quote. And as with any new technology, there is both a promise and a peril, or as media theorist Neil Postman famously said, every technology is both a burden and a blessing, not an either or, but a this and that. And this means for every advantage that a new technology offers, there's always a corresponding disadvantage. The disadvantage may exceed the importance of the advantage, or the advantage may well be worth the cost. Generative AI may be a new technology, but the reality is it's no different in this regard. There are both burdens and blessings, promises and perils, which is what the rapid response papers address. In the papers, we can see both the promise and the peril, the Faustian bargain of technology, as Postman calls it, at play once again. And it's this tension that we're hoping to explore a bit today and in this speaker series in our discussion of the papers. The collection of papers is also quite unique in that they specifically speak to Gen AI within the context of open education. And now there's been a lot of discussion about AI and education in general, but there's been maybe less so looking at the specifics of AI within the context of the unique affordances and consideration of open education and open educational practices. So for those of us who are deeply committed to open education and open educational practices, and the values that are embedded in those practices, things like fairness and equity, social justice, access, autonomy for both students and faculty, critical digital pedagogy, collaborative practices, knowledge construction and co-construction. I think these papers are very welcome and I think a much needed addition to our field. And if you haven't done so already, I would urge you to take some time to explore all the papers in the collection. I'm going to hand it back to Shira. I'm going to be back after the authors have done their presentations and facilitate a Q&A with the authors, and I hope you enjoy the next hour.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Clint. So I will now pass the baton to Dr. Shilibekova to discuss her paper, Addressing Challenges in Faculty Professional Development, UDL Training Through AI-Enhanced OER in a Non-English Context.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Thank you, Shira, for your kind introduction. And Clint, it's great to have you as our respondent. And a warm thank you to the MIT Open Learning team, Sarah Hansen and Sarah Schwetman, and to the Hewlett Foundation for supporting this initiative. It's been quite a learning process for me. Before I begin, I want to acknowledge that I'm joining you today from the traditional and unceded territories of the Semiahmoo First Nations here in White Rock, beautiful British Columbia, and grateful to be here. Today, I'm presenting a paper that actually grew into the core of my doctoral research, a localized AI-enhanced UDL-based open educational resource created for non-English Kazakh-speaking educators. When my daughter heard this title for the first time, she was like, "Mom, what a coded language you are talking. What is UDL, OER, so many abbreviations." We'll talk about that today. Next slide, please. this work began through the REACH project. So I want to contextualize a bit. It's a multi-country initiative led by Dr. Robert Williamson at Simon Fraser University. It was funded by Canada's SSHRC, and REACH focused on inclusive education for displaced and refugee children with disabilities, particularly in Jordan, Turkey, Canada, and Kazakhstan. Kazakhstan joined from the start this project, but not because of a formal refugee population they had, but because of this unique humanitarian situation. Back in 2019, Kazakhstan government launched a humanitarian Jusan operation that repatriated around 600 citizens, including 413 children from former ISIS-controlled territories and refugee camps in Syria. And 19 of those children were resettled in the Western Kazakhstan Atyrau region. Although I had moved to Canada back then, I remained closely connected to Atyrau State University faculty and colleagues, where I had previously served as Vice President for Strategic Planning and International Relations. And earlier in that capacity, I initiated this platform, Kids University, a community-based open learning for rural children, like from rural regions. And it became a sort of an early form for me of localized open education, grounded more in social connection and institutional support. I had to study different experiences of different kids universities around the world and try to localize those practices. So when this reintegration of repatriated children, displaced children from Syria, that support was needed, the faculty, the team at Atyrau University naturally turned to this space, to Kids University, because it was safe, it was working, it was trusted. And we included them into the REACH project to support that inclusion to the children with disabilities. But as the REACH project progressed, it became clear that the real challenge wasn't the children in the first place, but was the readiness of the people trying to help them. Faculty were committed, but lacked some training, digital fluency, no English language skills to be using the resources in English. So there were no resources, open resources in Kazakh. So I began offering some fragmented workshops, mostly around UDL framework and arts-based strategies. But I saw that we needed more of sustainable solutions. Next slide, please. So that's when the idea took shape. We saw that, well, we've developed a UDL-based open resource, asynchronous course in Kazakh that would educators learn from about inclusion and how to adapt it. So a resource that they could use flexibly in their own language. And at that stage, there was no AI. I was translating myself, using sometimes Google Translate to help, but it was not really helpful. So we had to adapt, again, culturally, pedagogically, considering Kazakh traditions of pedagogy as well. I reflected in my paper that much of the global literature on UDL and open education is in English and embedded in Western assumption about technology and access. And that disconnect made localization not just important, but essential and critical. Next slide, please. So in early 2024, I began exploring generative AI tools a bit cautiously. And actually, the main excitement was, could they help accelerate that localization, save my time with translation, generating some visuals, but with cultural care. So I experimented with ChatGPT for drafting, DALL-E for visuals, YesChat. There was a Kazakh GPT's chatbot that saved a lot of time as well. I was inspired partially by the Ludia, it's a UDL plus AI chatbot also, and I saw the potential there to make it more accessible. So this is overall the course that I've designed and piloted with Atyrau University was not generated by AI, but it was designed with this instructional design model, successive approximation model. And SAM, as its author, Michael Allen, reminds us, is not just about speed, being fast, being reiterative, it's about more listening. So that's what this project became, a sort of act of pedagogical listening through language, design, and response. Next slide, please. So we chose UDL, and I just quickly want to share the anecdotal part about translating actual concept into English, universal design for learning. And it proved a bit difficult. It's always tricky with those concepts. So machine translation gave us Ambebab Ohutu de Jobalau. And here, Ambebab, which is more of convenience store type of universality, and Jobalau is more about projecting or outlining or drafting. So after consultation we had with some of the doctor in philology at Aarhus State University, we made decisions. So I kind of was my decision, but I relied on their feedback as well to keep universal part, as it's an international term, and also design part, because we also have that term in Kazakh, so universal de okutu design. But yet, as you see, I kept UDL in English, abbreviation in brackets in English. And that also another strategic decision here, hard one, because I saw that it would be a hybrid that preserved both local clarity, but also global recognizability. So faculty could recognize it in English language, conferences, resources, or books, UDL, and use AI tools to translate those resources because they now know that it's about UDL. So I would call it conceptual bilingualism, the way to build both sort of familiarity and fluency across that academic scholarly context. Next slide, please. I will probably skip it. It's just another example of the translation and localization. It was quite a challenging part as well. Another resource that we used was this, again, Kazakh GPT. That saved so much time because I started designing my own Kazakh GPT and then thought, well, let me check, maybe some other smart people already done it before me. So, and voila, there was this free resource. Next slide, please. So the course had 95 completion rate among 25 faculty, and it was unusually high, to be honest. I was surprised for asynchronous professional development, which is like nobody really tracks the progress. So far, we had the pre-course survey and after-course survey anonymously, and knowledge scores. Again, we've seen increased 60% were those faculty who attended my previous fragmented workshops during the REACH project. So they knew something about UDL. That was really also like rewarding to see that. And the increase was to 85%. So there is a lot more to work on. And faculty actually shared that it reflected their realities. They felt that it was not translated or decoded from other language. So here, I felt like localization doesn't just increase access, but it's also about connection or to the content. Finally, next slide, please. The lessons I drew actually a lot more, but I thought the most important ones I would share today is that localization is foundational, not optional. It's important that we start with the design on mind, and it shouldn't be an afterthought. Second, AI integration requires critical human guidance. Yes, AI accelerates, it supports localization, but it cannot lead it. And finally, inclusive design requires institutional support. I mean, we had to get support from the Aarhus State University's administrative level, also to have access to their IT resources so that it is hosted on their platform. They helped us with the access to Articulate Rise platform, where we designed the first interactive elements of this course. And it's important that professional development isn't only inclusive, but also available, and institutional support is the key. And last slide, please. So that was a rapid response paper. It's still going on. It was my first pilot project I was excited about. At the moment, we have 2 more universities in Kazakhstan who are interested in hosting this course, and I assume for my doctoral dissertation, I would want to have a larger sample of respondents. And so look forward to include more. But this time, the platform sustainability is challenging and it's quite expensive sometimes in those areas. So we are exploring now simpler tools like Moodle maybe or Google Sites to keep resources open and replicable. And in future, I hope it will grow into sort of community of practice among Kazakh educators who this course actually brought together. And thank you for your time and listening to me. If there is one takeaway from my talk today, it's this: inclusive design does not begin with AI or frameworks. It begins with the people and the language we choose to design for. And if open education is truly to be open, then AI must serve as a bridge, not a gatekeeper, enabling educators to build resources not just in many formats, but in many voices as well. Thank you so much.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. We really appreciate it. As you are thinking of your questions and comments and ideas, please do put them in the Q&A and we will come back to them near the end of this session. So I would like to pass the baton now to Dr. Kimmons and Dr. Trust, who will talk about judicious AI use to improve existing OER.
Thank you, Shira, and I'm delighted to be here today, and what an incredible first presentation by Aya that I really enjoyed. I am presenting alongside my co-author, Dr. Royce Kimmons, and on behalf of our other co-author, Dr. George Valetsianos, today, and let's go ahead and jump in. Next slide, please. So generative AI technologies are powerful tools, but they come with significant costs. In terms of financial costs, just last week, CEO of OpenAI said using niceties like please and thank you cost the company upwards of tens of millions of dollars. And thinking about the environmental costs of these tools, which are quite substantial, unfortunately, many of the developers of AI technologies aren't very transparent or clear about the environmental impact of these tools. However, when looking at Google's 2024 sustainability report, it showed that there was a 13% increase year over year in greenhouse gas emissions, since totaling 48% since 2019. And they attributed that to increase in data centers and need for powering those. The same report also noted there was a 17% increase in water use, totaling 6.1 billion gallons of water, which is more than 9,000 Olympic-sized swimming pools, and water in that case is often used to cool down data centers. Some researchers have also tried to make some estimates about the environmental costs of these tools. One group of researchers found that generating an AI image, one or two AI images, takes as much electricity as charging your smartphone. Another group of researchers found that getting AI to provide medium-length responses, about 10 to 50 of them, takes about 16 ounces of water, which may not seem like a lot, but then when you multiply that by the hundreds of millions of users of these tools daily, it's quite a significant cost, and also the fact that many of these data centers are housed in towns that they are now taking electricity and water and other resources from the residential supply. These tools also have several other ethical issues in terms of their accuracy, hallucinating information, and have exacerbated the digital divide between those who have access to these tools and know how to use them and know how to think critically about them and those who do not. So I'm going to hand it over to my co-author here, Dr. Royce Kimmons, to talk more about judicious uses of AI.
Thank you. So, as has already been mentioned, AI came into kind of this critical consciousness of everyone, or for the vast majority of people, with the advent of specifically ChatGPT, but chatbots specifically as a type of AI. And for that reason, whenever we talk about AI, whenever you hear a new presentation about AI, most of the time it's going to be about chatbots. And that's true in education, it's true in every field. And so the kind of knee-jerk reaction that we've had to AI across lots of disciplines is, oh, we can use AI now to do some exciting things. Let's throw chatbots at our problems and see what happens. The problem, though, well, one of the problems is that chatbots require a high level of literacy, as Torrey mentioned. They also require a lot of energy, more than a lot of the other kinds of AI or uses of AI that we often deal with. And so what we would refer to as a non-judicious use of AI specifically when it comes to OER, is to embed a chatbot or to throw a chatbot at a learner and just expect the chatbot or the learner to be able to interact with the chatbot in a way that is beneficial to the learner. Like going back to Aya's example, giving a learner a chatbot and asking them to localize OER for themselves, right? Now, there are other options, there are other ways of thinking about this. And so what we're framing here is what we refer to as a judicious use of AI. And what this means is that instead of having the user or the learner interact directly with the AI, are there high value things that we can have AI do that we then store, we save the results of what the AI has done, and then we distribute those to learners at scale. So this requires 3 steps. First, we identify impactful improvements to existing OER that can be accomplished with AI, and I'll share some examples in a second. Then we use AI to enact and store those improvements in a finite, typically one-time manner. So if we use AI to localize some content, we store that. And then the third step, we release what we have done under a new, as OER themselves. So we efficiently serve those improved materials to learners at scale as OER. Next slide, please. So our context for doing this is EdTech Books, which is an open textbook publishing platform. Just a little bit of information about the background for this. So this system is very intentionally open. It's very intentionally available to everybody. There are no login or access walls. Currently, we serve our content to over 1.5 million users across the world every year. We have over 200 published books, about 8,000 published chapters. All content is automatically converted into PDFs and Microsoft Word documents as well, so they can be accessed offline. And all content is also converted to high-quality audiobooks using AI. And that audio is stored so that people throughout the world can access audio versions of this content as well. And so when thinking about how can we use AI to improve this kind of an OER resource, well, if we have 1.5 million users accessing our content, we don't want 1.5 million users using chatbots to get at content that they need. Why can't we just figure out what our users want, use AI to create that, and then re-release that to them as OER in a way that is more efficient and more sustainable? Next slide, please. So we'll give 4 examples of how this plays out. So one is simple glossary. So if we want learners to be able to define terms that they come across, we can use AI. So if someone clicks on a term, AI will define it. But what we don't want is AI to have to define this term 1 million times. So if 1 million people don't know what an abduction is, for instance, we don't want AI to be called upon 1 million times to define this. Instead, what we can do is we have the author decide what they want defined. So they create a glossary. They use AI to create an initial definition for this, and then we serve that definition up to all users. So that makes it more sustainable, makes it lower cost, and also allows the human, so in this case, the author, to have control over, have a quality assurance control over that definition. So that, for instance, we've had examples in the past, and you've seen many papers written about this, about how AI is biased, how AI replicates even things like racism and sexism in what it provides to people. So by allowing a human, in this case, the author, to come between what the AI generates in terms of the definition and what is provided to the learner, it allows the author to take control of that and to ensure that content that is being provided is unbiased and so forth. Next slide, please. Another example is in the form of learning checks. So we can have an AI go through content, and maybe after every couple of paragraphs, it discerns what is the core content of this paragraph, and it creates a multiple choice learning check that then is stored as static HTML and with some JavaScript layered on top that is then efficiently served to all learners. So you don't have to have an AI to ask, so that every learner doesn't have to ask an AI to help me find what are the key points of this content. We do it once, and then we provide that to all learners so that all learners can benefit from that learning check, whether or not they have access to an AI. Next slide, please. The audiobook example that I already mentioned, audiobooks, doing high quality audio with an AI actually takes a ton of energy, and it takes a lot of time, even with a high powered machine. So if you were to have a learner, for instance, in the Philippines, click on a chapter and have AI translate it into audio for them, that would be hugely expensive, use a ton of bandwidth, and just not be sustainable. So what we do with audio is whenever a chapter is edited or updated, we have AI go through and create an audio version of that. And some of these chapters, the audio ends up being an hour and a half long. Like these are huge audio files. It takes a ton of energy to create, but we generate this once, we store it in efficient storage with like Amazon S3 that then can be mirrored across multiple sites across the world so that it can be easily accessed at multiple points across the world. And so we're generating it once, but we're able to deliver it to thousands or millions of learners at scale. And next slide, please. And one final example is translation. So instead of having learners have to have like an account with ChatGPT or something like that to translate content for them that they come across in an OER, why can't we bake that into the system itself so that in our case, we're translating all of our content into English, Spanish, Portuguese, Chinese, and then those are made available to all learners who come to the content. So it's translated once by AI, and that initial translation is costly, but once you scale it across thousands of users who are accessing it, the cost per user is negligible. And so the return on investment it approaches infinity because at some point you create this resource and then it's available to everybody. And then last slide. So to compare these two, non-judicious use tends to be very expensive to scale versus judicious use is inexpensive. Judicious use uses less energy and has resulting much lower economic or ecological and economic impact because learner AI interaction is visible. So like in the case of the glossary, the author can see what the AI is providing before it's provided to the learner. So the author can step in and do quality assurance on it. So AI responses can be audited, verified, and checked for quality. Those AI responses are available to everyone. So there's no equity concern where only some people have access to enhanced resources because they have licenses with specific AI tools. No, because the AI results are generated and stored and then shared with everyone, they're equitably available to everyone. And it requires low bandwidth and can be made available offline. So if we create, like, for instance, an audiobook version of a chapter or generate other like translations of chapters, learners can download those and access them offline without having to have persistent access to like ChatGPT, for instance.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. So I'd now like to invite Clint to have a larger conversation with Aya, Royce, and Torrey. And that will last probably 10, 15 minutes or so, 15 minutes, and then we will come back to your questions. So do make use of that Q&A function and let us know what questions or comments you have as you are thinking them.
Great. Thank you, Shira. And I want to start with you and your project because the localization work that you did reminds me a lot of the localization work that we did in the early days of the BC Open Textbook Project way back in 2013. One of the challenges we had when we started our Open Textbook Project here in British Columbia was taking US-based textbooks and contextualizing them and localizing them for a Canadian context. And I can tell you, it was difficult work. And I really wish we had access to some of the tools that you did when doing this kind of localization work. But, as you note, using AI was not without its challenges to do localization. And the one I want to hone in on is the linguistic barriers with AI translation, as I think this might be a good example of a type of cultural bias that we might find in AI tools. In your paper, you noted that translating resources while preserving pedagogical integrity requires more than direct translation. I wonder if you can expand on that a little bit. Why was the direct translation inadequate, and how did you work around that?
Yeah, thank you so much, Clint. I really appreciate you naming that experience with textbooks localization. It resonates deeply with what we encountered, but we had AI and all those tools that supported this process that made it way easier, even fun sometimes. We were juggling with different dialects and terms it's sort of educating and training AI as well. So one of the most consistent challenges we faced was not just linguistic, really. It was more cultural and AI and machine translation tools Google Translate. That was the first thing they used. It was more familiar to faculty involved. They often carried more of that implicit cultural assumptions already embedded in the source material, whatever they were using. So as I mentioned in my today's talk, universal design itself, like seemingly neutral, brought up some unintended associations with translated directly into Kazakh, like Ambebab, which more use, like in my childhood, we would say Ambebab store, which is universal store, convenience store. So technically it worked, but culturally it undermined the integrity of the concept. That wasn't also the translation issue, exactly as you said, about, around the cultural bias, the idea that what is neutral in English may carry different weight in other, or tone or authority in another language when it translated directly. So all these biases magnified by this machine translation at the same time, if used without reflection or review from human judgment, may lead to sort of not even confusion, but misrepresentation, or worse, unintentional reinforcement of cultural hierarchies, right? What we call through this gaze of open access. But yet we wanted really that it sounded natural, respectful, and pedagogically coherent. So educators do not learn something new, but rather review what they have been doing with these new tools or new approaches. So we brought really, I've involved a lot of feedback from faculty at our university. I'm very grateful to them here. We even asked some of the educators from different regions of Kazakhstan where we would have some dialect. So we wanted the term would resonate with someone in Western Kazakhstan as well as in South Kazakhstan, where I'm from. So we we had to actually to think about those peculiarities there. And it was not only about clarity. I think for me, it was more about credibility. Thanks.
So to get around some of what you were finding, it sounds like you definitely had humans in the loop, kind of reviewing the work that was coming out, and the importance of having people still involved checking the work, I think, is something that I also picked up on in Royce and Torrey's paper too, the importance of humans in the loop and having oversight. I think you mentioned human quality assurance is essential to correct AI hallucinations, errors, and misinformation. And so Torrey and Royce, I want to bring you into the conversation here and just maybe tell us some of the ways that you're thinking about how to address this in your work to ensure that there are humans in the loop.
I can start briefly just from an author perspective. So I have written several books on the EdTech Books platform, which are open educational resources, OERs. And along the way, Royce has been adding in a lot of different features, which I always love to try out in my books. And at one point, there was like an AI generated abstract. And I'm talking, one of my books has like 700 pages because I have a co-author who just loves to write nonstop. And so, you know, I don't have time to go through and write an abstract for every single one of those chapters. But when I had the AI generated version, I was like, ooh, this is not like fully capturing what happened in this chapter. But it's a starting point. And so for me, I found it helpful that it put text on paper for me then to work around and revise and figure out what is the most important part of this chapter I want to include in this abstract, rather than starting from a blank page. And I do think that helped speed up the ability to include abstracts. And but I do think there had to be a human in the loop in that process, because the AI, I don't think ever created an abstract that was fully accurate and correct for any of the chapters its very first try. And we know how these tools work. They're predictability machines, guessing which words go together. So you have to have that human aspect. And that's what Royce has really built into the EdTech Books platform.
And just to build on that, so it's accuracy, it's quality, it's speed, but it's also contextualization too. That's one of the things that AI struggles with a bit. I mean, especially if you're not providing it with deep understanding of the context. So if I'm writing to elementary school teachers, for instance, that context is going to be very different from writing to a group of professional engineers and what I convey, how I convey it. And so using the AI to create kind of a boilerplate or a beginning kind of outline of what this looks like, just getting something on the page is really, I don't know, encouraging as an author, because then it's easier to edit, it's easier to go and adjust than it is to just stare at a blank page. And so that applies to abstracts, it applies to like glossary terms, and even beyond that too, to things that are more strictly created entirely by the AI, like audiobooks. Just being able to go and listen to it and make sure that you're happy with the way that it sounds is an important step. And I guess translations as well. Translations are a bit tricky because when we, like, for instance, if I translate my content into 10 different languages, I don't know all 10 of those languages. So we have built in the ability for the author to go in and edit what the AI has generated and is now providing in those different languages. But unless I also collaborate with people who speak those languages or that can help me engage in quality assurance with those languages, then even though I'm there as the author, I'm not able to do much, or I don't even know what to do. So there is, so part of it is how we structure our relationships with the AI by putting the author between the AI and the learner. But part of it too is thinking about what resources and literacies are needed to the author so they can actually engage in quality assurance once the AI has generated results.
I want to circle back to that literacy piece in just a moment here, but first I want to talk a little bit about the environmental aspects in your paper and the environmental costs of using generative AI, because your paper raises the environmental costs as really being a serious social justice issue. And I think there's a real tension, especially for us in education. I mean, we're feeling this pressure to perhaps use these tools. We're seeing some of the benefits of using these tools, but we know that there are steep costs to actually using them. And this is kind of a big question, but I mean, how do you think we go about reconciling that tension between the benefits of generative AI and the environmental costs that you talk about?
Well, I think Torrey brought to my attention just recent research on even how youth are using AI, right? So they use it for information seeking primarily. So for instance, if they don't know what the word abduction means, they'll go to ChatGPT to ask it what abduction is. Well, doing that using a chatbot, specifically like the newest versions of the chatbot, like if you're using a 4.1 or something like that, you're going to use 10 times more energy than if you did a Google search, which is going to use 10 or 100 times more energy than if you just went to Merriam-Webster and did it and actually typed it in there. So, or had a dictionary in your operating system that you're using. So I mean, it's super easy. I'm on a Mac, just hit Command space and type in a word, and it uses the built-in dictionary to define it for you. But youth do not know how to do that. So that's a literacy question, which we can talk more about later. But I think part of what it speaks to is just that we don't understand what our tools are good for and what they're efficient at. And what is, like, because there's cost associated with everything that we do with them, we don't know what is a legitimate cost. Is it really desirable to use this much energy to define a word that I could just easily find a definition to a different way? And so I think so much of it is, there's the literacy aspect, but there's also just like, for those of us who are creating tools or in positions to provide resources to people, hopefully we're not falling into that same trap where we're not just throwing oh, I need to define terms. Let me throw the newest version of ChatGPT at it, which I know is going to be super resource intensive. There are lots of different large language models out there. Lots of them are more efficient than others. So for instance, in our current, on EdTech books, in our current use of the glossary and the abstract feature, we're using Llama 3.2, but we're using the 3 billion or the 3 billion parameter model, which is much more efficient than the kind of flagship Llama is 70 billion. I don't know what the ChatGPT model, current ChatGPT models are at right now. If you're not an AI person, what that just basically means is that 3 billion parameter model, you can run it even like on a pretty, mid-range like laptop if you wanted to. It's not a super intensive model to run versus if you're running cutting edge models, you need a super high performing machine that's going to use a ton of energy. I actually have a super high performing Mac Studio under my desk here right now that is constantly running stuff in the background because I'm analyzing data and I can feel the heat coming off of it. And so I have to have the air up higher in my office. So I'm creating an ecological concern here within my office, just using how I'm using AI. But using more efficient models, and I think using models that are designed for the kinds of things that we're after. I don't need to throw a 70 billion parameter model at a simple definition task. And by not doing that, I'm drastically saving cost. I'm drastically saving ecological impacts.
It's interesting that you mentioned that. I mean, one of the things I use a large language model, but I've been working on a locally hosted large language model. So I've been using a tool called LM Studio and running models just on my desktop, because that's one of the ways that I kind of feel okay about the environmental impact of using large language models, is if I can at least run it locally on my laptop, then I'm not, relying on huge data centers to power the work that I'm doing. And it has been one of the ways that I've been kind of managing that environmental concern, and I think maybe holds out a little bit of hope for the sort of more basic queries that we tend to do, or that as you mentioned, youth tend to do on the large language models. I want to stick on the technology piece a bit and just talk a little bit. And I know Royce, you talked a little bit about Llama, and I do want to come back to that. But I mean, I want to talk about the technology choices you made for both of your projects, because I think the technology choices kind of do paint a complex and really a very realistic picture of the kind of mix of open and proprietary tools that we often have to use in open education projects. So let me start with you here. Can you talk through some of the rationale for your technology choices for your project? And is there anything that you think you might have done differently with your technology choices?
Oh, yeah, that was a tricky part. Of course, the easiest one was ChatGPT, as our colleagues at other university also had started experimenting that. But let's say for translation, like Google Translate was the first intuitive way like to go exactly for English, the matching the terms. So when I started to explore AI tools, I think I looked for those who had free access in the first place. So faculty back in Kazakhstan context wouldn't, or university wouldn't have burden like to pay for those things. I didn't have special funding for that, so it was all voluntarily like a volunteering project for us. So it should be free, at least for a trial period for a couple of weeks or months. That even would be helpful. And because it was a very speedy process, we wanted to be fast and prototype fast based on this SAM model that I followed for instructional design. So, and technology that at that moment was mainly accessible was through the OpenAI platform, definitely. We've tested with Poe, another platform where we looked specifically for their like approaches, what kind of data they use or how they process it. In that context, what's interesting, not the like ethical or privacy issues, they pop up later on with the faculty as they started to learn more about the technology. So, and we didn't have a clear criteria for which would be the best or how even to access or assess that technology. I think the start was very simple, like free, accessible, easy to use in any language, and helpful. So
Wonderful. If I may interject, there's a handful of really juicy questions in the Q&A. So we're going to go ahead and start with Vikram Singh, who asks, how to use judicious AI in the case of dynamic content?
Yeah, so it's a great question. The short answer is we have to build systems that allow us to do it. And it's similar to just modern web approaches. So so going back in time to when I first built the alpha version of EdTech books, I had non-AI tools that I built that would generate PDFs of all the content on the platform. And so the issue was, dynamic content, like authors are adjusting content continually, but we want to provide a static version of it as a PDF. And so my brilliant thought was, let me just have the web server generate the PDF every time someone wants to access it. But the problem is the amount of energy to generate a PDF out of that dynamic content it's really heavy. And so when you have 100 people try to do it at the exact same time, your server fails very quickly. But it's a similar kind of thing with AI in the sense that, yeah, you have dynamic content. You want to create like static snapshots of it at different times that then you provide efficiently to people. But so you just have to figure out when is it appropriate to take one of those snapshots. You don't want to create a snapshot every single time. Like say someone wants a translation of your chapter. You don't want to create a snapshot every single time someone asks for a translation. Maybe when you edit the content, you make a significant edit, then you flag it, and then it creates a snapshot of it that the AI uses as to create a translation that it efficiently serves up. But you have to create kind of what those milestones are, decide how much of a change to the dynamic content merits regeneration with the AI or re-involving the AI. So that's always challenging. Yeah. So like in terms of like the audio, like very concrete example, in terms of like the audiobooks that we generate, if someone goes on and corrects a typo, I'm probably not going to regenerate the entire audiobook for that chapter just because a typo was changed in the text. But if paragraphs are added or something like that, then yeah, we'll initiate a rebuild.
Well, thank you. Our next question comes from Mohammed Saeed, and the question is, in the context of professional education, how can institutions ensure that AI tools used for assessment and feedback are fair, transparent, and free from bias, especially when serving diverse learner populations?
Yeah, thank you, Mohammed. That's a really critical question, especially in the context of professional education, definitely where assessment often shapes access to opportunity. And if institutions want to ensure that AI tools used for assessment and feedback are fair and transparent, especially for diverse learning population, the first step, at least what we've learned and observed from our experience, is to recognize that bias is not a technical error there, and it's often a reflection of whose language, norms, learning behaviors the system was trained on. And one of the lessons that specifically stood out for my colleagues there is that fairness requires human context. We discussed that specifically at the level of design. And it's not enough to translate just rubrics or adapt instructions. Institutions here, we really wanted to prompt them to think, were these models trained with us in mind, right? No, obviously in the beginning. So we recognize that culturally relevant, let's say, expression of knowledge, that's something that even the feedback, when the feedback was given, we should be aware that the feedback was maybe based on Western academic writing conventions or unfamiliar terminology or a different logic of argumentation that is alien to that cultural or context, right? So, and that feedback will not be actionable. So therefore, for us was to get the feedback and again, translate it, quote unquote, to the management of the university who were observing the project in a way that it also supports that learning and helps them to improve. So here, that building human in the loop validation, I think it's very important. Being able to interpret AI behavior or make AI behavior interpretable. So faculty and staff should be able to see that what's the model is evaluating and why. So the clear explanation reasoning is important. And have a feedback again, not as a design opportunity, not just a measurement output, if it's a good project or a good course or a good, we need to not to guide learning across context, like not only through that direct feedback again. So for institutions to be aware of that, it's important.
Beautiful, thank you. Our next, I just want to get as many questions in as possible, but please, Royce, go ahead.
I just want to mention just auditability is super important for this. So one of the big problems with AI is that you put in your input and then you get output and it's just this huge black box. You have no idea what happened, right? And so one of the ways to help alleviate that, so like I'm in a former life, I was a high school English teacher. So if I wanted AI to give me feedback according to my rubric that I've created for student essays, if I say, here's the rubric, here's a student essay, give me feedback. Well, the essay has lots of different components to it, right? And so the feedback I'm going to get is, it's just this really messy black box. So I don't know why it's saying what it's saying in all these different ways. It may not even remember all the criteria that I gave it, and it just gets lost very quickly. And so one of the kind of the general best practices that I've come to realize is that when you're working with AI, it's best to be as discreet as possible in what you're asking it to do. So instead of asking it like one omnibus prompt, like do this thing, and it does this huge kind of black box thing in the background, then you get the results and you have no idea where this came from. Ask it more discrete things. Ask it, okay, instead of like feeding it my entire rubric, feed it one element of my rubric. How did it do on this specific thing? And then you get that feedback because it's easier to audit on very specific small black boxes than on a huge black box, right? And so by separating it out like that, it allows you to audit and to do quality assurance more effectively.
Ties into some of the other questions, I think. The next question is from Jessica Gamella, and her question is, I appreciate the examples of judicious use. Could you recommend where to find data on learner interactions with AI to help anticipate learner needs and preferences and support the judicious use of AI with open educational resources?
I'll just say most of what we do comes out of kind of a priori assumptions that we're making about learners based upon instructional design. So like, what do we already know students are going to want? So that's one way. Another way is using learning analytics and just UX like guerrilla research with our learners. So as learners read through a chapter, we have a quality assurance rating at the bottom where they can rate this in 5 stars or 1 to 5 stars. And then we get feedback from them, like what would they want? Or as authors request things, what would they want? So there's no like single place to go, but I think that, yeah, looking to UX research on like what are high impact things we can do for learners to help them, looking at instructional design research to do that as well. But then also having some kind of a mechanism for feedback to help us to know what is it that our learners wish that they had, or maybe our learners are going through all of our OER and copy pasting all of it into ChatGPT to get a Cliff Notes version of it. Even just knowing that they're doing that is super valuable because then we know, okay, that's a use case that would be used that we should be able to provide to them that would eliminate a lot of this waste and redundancy of if we have multiple users doing this.
Fantastic, thank you. I think we have time for one more question, and it's actually from another one of the authors from the rapid response papers, and I'm not going to pronounce their name correctly, but I will do my best. Joao Alberto Arantes do Amaral asks, the environmental impact is one of the unintended consequences of AI use that is largely overlooked today. How can we make these impacts more visible?
So this always continues to surprise me, I guess, because I'm in the AI and education world and early on learned about the environmental impacts. And so when I talked to someone about it who said, I had no idea, I was just talking to a reporter last week who was like, I had no idea there was environmental impact. And then on the other side, there's people who literally won't use AI because of the environmental impact. And there's everyone in between trying to figure this all out. I want to contextualize this really quickly in the last minute or so. Right now, like the, global impact of data energy, data center energy uses is like 1.5% of the global energy. So it is an impact and it's expected to double, but it's not like massively huge in destructing our environment just yet. I do think, though, it is something we need to pay attention to. And I would love for ChatGPT to say, before you prompt, this might take this much water, this much energy. I don't think any of these companies will do that because that will ruin their profit margins. But maybe an AI tool will come out. Just like, Ecosia for internet searches can show you how much like trees it's planting or carbon dioxide it's reducing from the environment. So I would love to see that more. But right now, I think it comes down to AI literacy. A lot of this comes down to AI literacy and preparing people who use AI to think critically about what are the unintended consequences of these tools. because that's a really important impact on society.
Well, that's the perfect transition for me to thank you all, because our next webinar is actually about AI literacy and AI evaluation. So deep appreciation and thanks to all of our speakers today for joining us, for writing your papers, for doing your work, and for having this public conversation. We're really eager to continue the conversation, and thank everyone for, I just want to thank everyone for attending today. This is really exciting, and you can sign up for updates of the initiative, and we'll sign off here at 3 o'clock. So thanks so much, everyone, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.
Thank you, Shira. Thank you, everyone.